Savannah, Georgia, spring 1793. Catherine Green watches enslaved workers process cotton at the only rate biology allows. 1 person, 1 pound per day. Upstairs, a Yale-educated tutor sketches a machine that will break that law, make the South obscenely wealthy, condemn millions to bondage, and trigger a war killing 600,000. European engineers mock its clumsiness right up until it causes the largest economic shock in American history. The bottleneck cotton should have been impossible in America. The math simply did not work. The problem was not growing the plant. Cotton thrived in the southern climate, erupting from the soil in great clouds of white fiber that promised wealth beyond imagination. The problem was extracting value from what you grew. Cotton exists in 2 varieties, and the difference between them was the difference between profit and bankruptcy. Long staple cotton, also called Sea Island cotton, produced fiber with seeds that separated easily. A worker could clean 50 pounds per day. But long staple cotton was temperamental, growing only in a narrow coastal band where the soil and humidity aligned perfectly. It was profitable, but geographically limited. Short staple cotton, by contrast, grew anywhere. It tolerated poor soil, survived drought, and flourished across the entire American South. Millions of acres of potential farmland could support it, but short staple cotton had a fatal flaw. The seeds clung to the fiber with a grip that seemed designed by nature specifically to torment farmers. The green seeds embedded themselves in the white fluff, tangled in the fibers like burrs and wool. Removing them by hand required patience, dexterity, and endless hours of tedious labor. A skilled worker, moving with practiced efficiency from dawn to dusk, could clean 1 pound per day. 1 pound. The economics were devastating. A farmer could grow acres of cotton, watch it bloom across his fields like snow in summer, harvest bales of raw product, and still face bankruptcy because the processing bottleneck made the entire operation unprofitable. The labor required to separate seeds from fiber consumed all potential profit. Planters did the maths and reached the same conclusion. Short staple cotton was a beautiful, useless crop. You could grow it, but you could not sell it. The fiber sat in warehouses, technically valuable, but economically worthless because human hands could not process it fast enough to justify the effort. Southern planters watched the early textile mills rising in New England and England, hungry for raw cotton, and felt the frustration of seeing opportunity they could not exploit. The mills would buy every bale the South could produce, but the South could not produce at a price that made sense. The bottleneck was not in the fields, it was in the fingers. This was the world Eli Whitney entered in 1792, a world where cotton was simultaneously the most promising and most impossible. Crop in America, a world where everyone agreed that short staple cotton processing could not be mechanized because the seeds were simply too stubborn, the fiber too delicate, and the work too intricate for crude machinery. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The outsider. Eli Whitney was not a cotton farmer. He was not a Southern planter, not an agricultural expert, and not someone who had spent his life studying the intricacies of fiber crops. He was a 27-year-old Yale graduate who had grown up in Massachusetts building tools in his father's workshop. He was heading south to take a position as a private tutor, and he understood cotton farming about as well as a fish understands mountaineering. But Whitney possessed something that separated him from every planter who had accepted the cotton bottleneck as unchangeable reality. He was an engineer who looked at problems and saw mechanisms. Where others saw cotton seeds clinging to fiber, Whitney saw a separation problem that nature had solved 1,000 times in different contexts. Where others saw delicate work requiring human touch, he saw repetitive motion that could be replicated by simple machinery. The tutoring position fell through almost immediately. The salary was not what had been promised, and Whitney found himself stranded in Georgia with no income and no clear prospects. But he had made a connection that would change American history. Catherine Green, the widow of Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene, invited Whitney to stay at her plantation called Mulberry Grove while he figured out his next move. It was there, in the social gatherings of Southern planters, that Whitney first heard the endless complaints about cotton processing. These were men who owned land, commanded labor, and understood agriculture intimately, but they were trapped by a problem that seemed to have no solution. They needed a machine that could grip cotton fiber firmly enough to pull it through a barrier, but gently enough not to destroy it. They needed something that could hold seeds back while allowing fiber to pass. They needed a mechanism that did not exist. Whitney listened to these complaints with the detached curiosity of someone who did not know enough to recognize impossibility when he heard it. He began sketching. Catherine Green, according to later accounts, encouraged him. She provided financial support and workshop space. Within weeks, Whitney had built a prototype. The speed of this development reveals something crucial. Whitney was not discovering new principles or inventing exotic mechanisms. He was applying basic mechanical concepts to a problem that agricultural experts had overcomplicated in their minds. He approached cotton processing the way he would approach any separation problem, with wire, wood, and rotating cylinders. The planters who had spent decades wrestling with cotton seeds expected complexity. They expected sophisticated machinery that mimicked the delicate work of human fingers. What Whitney gave them was almost insultingly simple. The breakthrough. The cotton gin, as Whitney called it, was a machine so simple that European engineers would later insist it could not possibly be original. It consisted of a wooden cylinder mounted horizontally in a frame. Wire teeth, bent at right angles, protruded from the cylinder like pins from a pincushion. The cylinder rotated, driven by a hand crank or, later, by animal or water power. The raw cotton fed into a hopper, where it pressed against a slotted barrier. The slots were wide enough to allow cotton fiber to pass through, but too narrow for seeds. As the cylinder rotated, the wire teeth caught the cotton fiber and pulled it through the slots. The seeds, too large to follow, fell away into a separate chamber. A rotating brush on the opposite side of the cylinder swept the cleaned fiber free, preventing it from wrapping around the mechanism. That was it. Wire teeth, a slotted barrier, rotating cylinders, and a brush. No exotic materials, no complex gearing, no mechanisms that required precision manufacturing. A competent carpenter could build one in a week. The elegance was in what it did not do. The gin did not try to replicate human fingers. It did not attempt to grip seeds individually or manipulate fiber with care. It simply used differential sizing. The holes were the right width. The teeth pulled in one direction. Physics did the rest. Whitney tested his prototype in the spring of 1793. The results were so extraordinary that witnesses accused him of trickery. The machine cleaned cotton at a rate 50 times faster than human hands. A single worker operating a gin could process 50 pounds per day instead of 1. Later models, driven by water or animal power, could process 1,000 pounds per day. The numbers meant that short staple cotton had suddenly become the most profitable crop in America. What had been economically impossible was now economically inevitable. The entire South could grow cotton. Every acre of marginal farmland that had sat unused could now produce a cash crop. The bottleneck had evaporated. Whitney filed for a patent immediately. On March 14, 1794, he received patent number 72X. On paper, he owned the rights to the most valuable agricultural technology in American history. In reality, he owned nothing but expensive lawsuits and bitter frustration. European mockery. When news of Whitney's gin reached British textile manufacturers in 1794, the reaction was not admiration. It was condescension. British engineers examined drawings of the device and declared it crude American tinkering. They saw a machine built from common materials using basic principles, and they concluded that anything so simple could not represent genuine innovation. European patent offices received applications for cotton processing machines that featured elaborate gear trains, precision, metalwork, and sophisticated mechanisms designed to replicate the delicate work of human hands. The British designs were beautiful in their complexity. Multi-stage separation systems that processed cotton through sequential refinements, mechanical fingers that gripped individual seeds, pneumatic systems that attempted to blow seeds away from fiber. These machines represented hundreds of hours of engineering work and reflected the assumption that separating cotton required sophisticated machinery. The British manufacturers were trapped by their own expertise. They knew textile processing intimately. They understood the delicate nature of cotton fiber and the stubborn adhesion of seeds. This knowledge led them to assume that mechanization required complicated solutions. Whitney's design, with its brutal simplicity, seemed too crude to be effective. Some British engineers built copies of the Whitney gin, tested them, and then improved them with additional mechanisms. They added more stages, more brushes, and more separation barriers. These enhanced gins were more complex, more expensive to build, and marginally more efficient. The engineers were proud of these improvements, viewing them as proof that Whitney's original design was merely a rough prototype that required European sophistication to perfect. This mockery would continue for nearly a decade. British textile journals published articles describing the American cotton gin as an interesting but primitive device that demonstrated the mechanical ingenuity of an undeveloped nation. The subtext was clear. Americans could tinker, but they could not engineer. The mockery stopped abruptly when the economic data arrived. By 1800, American cotton exports had increased 700%. By 1810, they had increased 3,000%. The crude American machine was drowning British textile mills in cheap, high-quality fiber. The simple gin was not a prototype. It was the solution. And the British had wasted a decade building unnecessary complexity while American cotton production exploded. The patent disaster. Eli Whitney's patent was worthless before the ink dried. The problem was not the legal document. The patent was valid, properly filed, and clearly described the invention. The problem was that the invention was too simple to protect. A gin could be built in any workshop by any carpenter with basic tools. There were no secret components, no proprietary materials, and no manufacturing processes that required specialized knowledge. The drawings Whitney submitted with his patent application were clear enough that they functioned as construction blueprints. Every planter in the South who saw a gin immediately understood how it worked and how to replicate it. Within months of Whitney's first demonstration, copies appeared across Georgia and South Carolina. These were not sophisticated patent infringements. They were direct replications built by local blacksmiths and carpenters who had simply observed the mechanism and reproduced it. Some copied Whitney's design exactly. Others made minor modifications, changing the spacing of the teeth or the width of the slots, then claimed these alterations made their machines different enough to avoid patent infringement. Whitney partnered with Phineas Miller, Catherine Green's plantation manager, to form a business plan. Instead of selling gins, they would install them at processing centers and charge farmers a fee, keeping 1/3 of the cleaned cotton as payment. This model would allow them to maintain control over the machines and enforce their patent monopoly. The Southern planters reacted with rage. They viewed Whitney's pricing as extortion. They had land that could now grow profitable cotton, but they would have to surrender 1/3 of their crop to use the only machine that could process it. They refused. They built their own gins and dared Whitney to sue them. Whitney spent the next 13 years in court. He filed dozens of lawsuits against gin manufacturers and cotton planters. He traveled across the South, gathering evidence, taking depositions, and watching his legal costs exceed any potential revenue from his invention. The juries were Southern planters who benefited from cheap gins. The judges were Southern politicians who understood that enforcing Whitney's patent would strangle the regional economy. Whitney won some cases. In 1807, a federal court in Georgia ruled that his patent was valid and that the planters had infringed it. But enforcing the judgment was impossible. There were thousands of gins operating across the South. Whitney could not sue them all, and every time he won a case, new gins appeared with trivial modifications that required new lawsuits to challenge. The legal battles consumed Whitney's fortune and his health. By 1807, when his patent finally expired, he had earned almost nothing from the invention that had transformed American agriculture. The gin had made fortunes for Southern planters, created wealth for British textile manufacturers, and enriched Northern shipping companies. But Whitney died in 1825 with modest wealth, earned not from cotton, but from manufacturing muskets for the federal government. The patent disaster revealed a truth about innovation that would echo through American industrial history. Sometimes the most valuable inventions are the ones that cannot be protected. The gin was too simple, too easy to copy, and too essential to be controlled by one man. The simplicity that made it revolutionary made it impossible to monopolize. The economic explosion. The numbers tell a story of transformation so rapid that it reshaped the American economy within a single generation. In 1790, the United States exported 3,000 bales of cotton. These came primarily from the narrow coastal region where long staple cotton grew. The total value was negligible in national economic terms. Cotton was a minor crop, less significant than tobacco, rice, or indigo. By 1800, 7 years after Whitney's gin, American cotton exports had reached 73,000 bales. The increase was not linear, it was exponential. Short staple cotton had suddenly become viable, and Southern planters converted every available acre to cotton production. The explosion continued without pause. 1810, 178,000 bales. 1820, 335,000 bales. 1830, 732,000 bales. By 1840, the United States exported 1.35 million bales annually. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, American cotton exports exceeded 4 million bales per year. This was not gradual growth. This was an economic convulsion. In 70 years, American cotton production increased over 1,300-fold. No other crop, no other commodity, no other industry in American history has experienced transformation at this scale and speed. The gin did not just make cotton profitable, it made cotton inevitable. Land values in the South skyrocketed as previously worthless acreage suddenly could generate cash crops. Farmers who had struggled with subsistence agriculture found themselves calculating profits in thousands of dollars. The South, which had been economically stagnant in the 1790s, became wealthy beyond its wildest projections. This wealth concentrated in specific hands. Large plantations absorbed small farms. Economies of scale favored operations that could afford dozens of gins and hundreds of workers. The Southern economy stratified into a landed aristocracy that controlled vast acreages and the poor whites and enslaved blacks who worked them. Cotton became more than a crop. It became the foundation of American export economy. By 1840, cotton represented more than a half of all American exports. By 1860, that figure approached 60%. The phrase King Cotton emerged not as marketing, but as literal description of economic reality. Cotton dominated American international trade to a degree that no single commodity has dominated since. The gin had created an economic monoculture. The South grew cotton, exported cotton, and used the profits to buy manufactured goods from the North and Europe. Southern planters did not invest in factories, mills, or industrial development. They invested in land and labor. Cotton was too profitable to waste resources on anything else. This specialization created vulnerability that Southern leaders either ignored or deliberately dismissed. The entire regional economy depended on maintaining access to international markets and maintaining the labor system that made cotton profitable. Any disruption to either would trigger economic collapse. But in 1860, standing at the peak of cotton prosperity, Southern planters believed they had achieved invincibility. They controlled the commodity that clothed the world. They believed this made them untouchable. They were wrong. The terrible price. The cotton gin saved slavery in America. This is not speculation or interpretation. It is mathematical certainty confirmed by every economic and demographic record from the period. In 1790, slavery was dying. The institution was economically marginal, morally indefensible, and politically embattled. The northern states were abolishing it. The international slave trade was under attack. Even many Southern planters privately acknowledged that slavery was becoming too expensive to maintain and too controversial to defend. The economics told the story. Without profitable crops, enslaved labor was simply expensive labor. You had to feed, house, and guard workers year-round even when there was minimal work to be done. The tobacco economy that had sustained slavery in Virginia was exhausting the soil. Rice cultivation was geographically limited. Indigo had collapsed. There was no crop that justified the enormous capital investment required to purchase and maintain enslaved workers. Southern plantations in the 1790s were liquidating their enslaved populations, selling people south and west, or simply allowing the institution to gradually decline through natural attrition. Slavery was not experiencing sudden abolition, but it was clearly entering a long, slow death. The gin reversed this trajectory immediately. Cotton changed slavery from a declining institution into an expanding one, from a morally troubling legacy into an economic necessity. from something the South was slowly abandoning into something the South would fight a war to preserve. The numbers are brutal in their clarity. In 1790, there were approximately 694,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. This was not gradual growth. This was industrialized expansion driven by cotton profits. The internal slave trade became one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Enslaved people were sold from the declining tobacco regions of Virginia and Maryland to the expanding cotton regions of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Families were separated. Communities were destroyed. Human beings were reduced to units of production, calculated in pounds of cotton processed per day. The gin made this economically rational. A healthy enslaved worker could tend 5 acres of cotton, plant it, harvest it, and feed the raw bolls into gins that could process 1,000 pounds per day. The profit margin on this operation was extraordinary. An enslaved person who could be purchased for $1,000 in 1840 could generate $400 in annual cotton revenue. The return on investment was 40% per year. These numbers made slavery not just profitable, but essential to the Southern economic model. Cotton plantations required large workforces during planting and harvest seasons. The gin allowed rapid processing, which meant plantations could handle more acreage with the same number of workers. But they still needed those workers, and in the South, workers meant enslaved people. The political implications were catastrophic. As cotton profits exploded, Southern political leaders became increasingly militant in defending slavery. They were not defending an abstract principle or a traditional institution. They were defending the economic system that generated their wealth. Cotton had given slavery a new lease on life, and the Southern aristocracy would not surrender it without a fight. The gin had accomplished something that no one in 1793 could have imagined. It had taken an institution on the verge of extinction and transformed it into the economic engine of an entire region. It had made slavery not just profitable, but seemingly indispensable. This was Whitney's unintended legacy. He had solved a mechanical problem without considering the human consequences. The gin worked exactly as designed, but the system it enabled was built on human bondage. The efficiency came at a cost that would ultimately be paid in blood. The global shock. The cotton gin did not just transform the American South, it restructured the global economy. The shock waves reached across the Atlantic and reshaped British industrial society in ways that are still visible today. In 1790, Britain's textile industry was small, scattered, and limited by raw material availability. Cotton fiber was expensive, inconsistent in quality, and available in quantities too small to support large-scale manufacturing. British mills imported cotton from India, Egypt, and the West Indies, but these sources were unreliable and insufficient. The gin changed this equation overnight. By 1800, American cotton was flooding British ports. The fiber was cheap, consistent, and available in quantities that made mass production viable. British manufacturers who had operated small workshops with a dozen looms suddenly envisioned factories with hundreds of machines running simultaneously. Manchester became the center of this transformation. The city had been a modest market town in 1790. By 1830, it was the textile capital of the world, a sprawling industrial metropolis of smoking factories and crowded tenements. The growth was entirely powered by American cotton processed by Whitney's gin. The scale of this transformation is difficult to overstate. In 1800, Britain imported 26 million pounds of raw cotton. By 1860, that figure had increased to 1.1 billion pounds. This was not incremental growth. This was an industrial revolution built on a foundation of Southern cotton, processed by a machine that European engineers had dismissed as too crude to be significant. The British economy became dependent on American cotton to a degree that shaped international politics. British textile mills employed millions of workers. Those workers voted. The British government, regardless of its moral position on slavery, could not ignore the economic reality that its industrial prosperity depended on maintaining access to cotton produced by enslaved labor. This dependency created the conditions for one of the most cynical diplomatic gambits in modern history. When the American Civil War began in 1861, Southern leaders believed Britain would intervene on their behalf. The logic seemed unassailable. If the Union blockaded southern ports, British mills would run out of cotton. British workers would lose their jobs. The British government would be forced to break the blockade and recognize Southern independence. This was called cotton diplomacy, and it was based on an accurate assessment of British economic vulnerability. The Union blockade did create a cotton famine in Britain. Mills closed, workers rioted. The pressure on the British government was intense. For a time, it seemed the Confederate gamble might succeed. But the British government, facing a choice between economic interest and moral principle, chose to endure economic pain rather than support a slaveholding nation. The cotton famine was real, the suffering was real, but Britain did not intervene. The Confederate strategy failed, and with it, any hope of Southern victory. The global shock extended beyond Britain. The gin had created an international system where American cotton fed European factories, which produced textiles sold globally. This system enriched merchants, bankers, and manufacturers across multiple continents. But it was built on slavery, maintained by violence, and vulnerable to any disruption in the supply chain. When that disruption came in the form of civil war, the global economic impact was immediate. Cotton prices collapsed, then skyrocketed. Alternative sources in Egypt and India suddenly became viable. The monopoly that Southern planters had believed made them invincible proved to be their greatest vulnerability. The gin had created the system. The Civil War destroyed it, and the economic shock rippled across the world for decades. The legacy. The cotton gin is a machine that changed history by accident. Eli Whitney was trying to solve a processing bottleneck. He succeeded beyond his wildest imagination and triggered consequences he never intended and could not have predicted. The direct line from gin to Civil War is clear enough that historians barely debate it anymore. The gin made cotton profitable. Cotton made slavery profitable. Slavery became economically entrenched. The South built its entire society around an institution that the North found morally intolerable. Compromise became impossible. War became inevitable. 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. The number is so large it becomes abstract, but the causality is traceable. Whitney's wire teeth pulling, cotton through slots led, through a chain of economic and political consequences, to Gettysburg, Antietam, and Sherman's march through Georgia. This is not to blame Whitney for the Civil War. He did not create slavery. He did not force the South to build its economy on human bondage. He did not make the political choices that led to secession, but his invention created the economic conditions that made all of those things possible and profitable. The gin represents something darker than a failed invention or a patent dispute. It represents the danger of innovation without foresight. Whitney saw a mechanical problem and solved it brilliantly, but he never asked what would happen if cotton suddenly became the most profitable crop in America. He never considered how that profit would be generated or who would pay the human cost. Modern technology companies face similar questions. When social media platforms optimize for engagement, they create incentives that reshape public discourse in ways their engineers never intended. When automation increases efficiency, it displaces workers in patterns that echo the mechanization of agriculture. The gin teaches that solving one problem often creates others that are larger, more complex, and more difficult to address. The legacy extends beyond the Civil War. The cotton economy shaped regional development in ways that persist today. The South remained agricultural, while the North industrialized. Wealth concentrated in land ownership rather than business development. Education systems developed to serve plantation economies rather than industrial ones. These patterns, established during the cotton boom, influenced Southern economic development for more than a century. The gin also established the template for American agricultural mechanization. It proved that the right machine could transform farming from subsistence labor into industrial production. This insight led to the mechanical reaper, the combine harvester, and the entire agricultural revolution that turned the United States into a global food superpower. But the gin's most important legacy is the lesson it teaches about the relationship between technology and society. Machines are not neutral. They do not simply amplify existing patterns. They reshape incentives, redistribute power, and create new economic realities that force social and political change. Eli Whitney built a machine to separate cotton from seeds. Instead, he separated a nation from its future, enriched a region while condemning millions to bondage. and set in motion forces that would require a war to resolve. The gin worked exactly as designed, but the system it created failed catastrophically. This is the true story of the cotton gin, not a tale of American ingenuity or agricultural progress, but a reminder that solving technical problems is easy compared to managing the consequences. The Europeans mocked Whitney's crude machine. They stopped mocking when it triggered the largest economic shock in American history and helped cause a war that redefined the nation. The gin cleaned cotton efficiently, but the stains it left on American history have never fully washed out.